at this point, even though it's still early, it's pretty clear that Bernie Sanders will in fact be running for president again in 2020, but there is another likely contender in 2020 on the Democratic side, Kamala Harris. Now, going into the 2020 primaries, Bernie Sanders has an advantage. He has a level of name recognition comparable to Hillary Clinton's in 2016, and that scares the Democratic Party establishment because they don't want Bernie Sanders to win because they still believe that they need to cater to their donors. And if Bernie Sanders wins, then they're not going to be able to deliver on the promises that they've made to donors since they've already sold out. But what is the Democratic Party establishment doing to ensure that Bernie Sanders isn't successful again? Well, they are changing the rules to disadvantage Bernie Sanders. They're trying to rig it. Again. John Myers of the Los Angeles Times reports California Governor Jerry Brown has signed a bill moving the state's primary election to early March. Brown's decision, announced without fanfare on Wednesday, means the state will hold its presidential primary on March 3, 2020. It's a reversal from a decision made in 2011 to push the state's primary elections back until June, after years of trying and failing to entice major candidates to bring their campaigns to California instead of smaller, more rural states. Now, what is this really about? Well, in moving up California's primary, this gives a huge advantage to candidates from California, specifically Kamala Harris, who currently is the establishment's favorite pick for 2020. Now, the thing about Californian primaries is that they're difficult for relatively newer candidates. I mean, the state has a huge population. It's relatively large in size, territorially speaking too, so campaigning in the state is really difficult. So obviously, the candidate with more funds, more name recognition in that state will have the advantage, and this is something that benefits Kamala Harris. So obviously, this is the Democratic Party establishment's move to preemptively bias the 2020 primaries in favor of Kamala Harris. So I'm not necessarily worried that this will hurt Bernie Sanders, because I think Bernie Sanders is likely the favorite to win probably a majority of states in 2020. But what I am worried about is future elections, because this will make the anti-establishment candidate, any progressive candidate with less name recognition, this will make it more difficult for them to win in California. And the reason why the DNC moved red states ahead on the primary schedule was because they wanted to demoralize any of Hillary Clinton's potential opponents and give her an early lead. And this is what they're doing here. If they can give Kamala Harris an early lead, then they can do to Bernie what they did in 2016 and say, Bernie, Kamala won the race. Why are you still here? You should probably drop out and concede to Kamala Harris. Now, look, again, I think that Bernie will probably win California in spite of this, but it still just shows just how sleazy the Democratic Party establishment is. They clearly didn't learn their lesson after rigging a primary last time and then losing to Donald Trump, in part because they chose to rig the primary and pissed off, their base. They're doing the same fucking thing. And this makes me irate. It makes me so angry, because what they don't realize is that they are jeopardizing their own chances. They're shooting themselves in the foot, because if, for whatever reason, Bernie Sanders is not the Democratic nominee in 2020, if he does decide to run again as a Democrat, then you better do everything you can to make sure that the optics look good to progressives. Meaning, if we feel as though you rigged the primary and it was unfair, guess what's going to happen? The same fucking thing that happened in 2016. Progressives will stay home and not come out to support the candidate who cheated. Because people don't like voting for cheaters. People don't like feeling robbed. And really, this isn't just about California, because if they're willing to do this here, then it's showing that they're still willing to bias the rules in favor of the candidate that they like. And with the establishment already rallying around Kamala Harris, that's a bad sign for the fairness of the Democratic Party primaries in 2020. So the Democratic Party never learns. They just never learn. They still haven't gotten rid of superdelegates, even though they curtailed the power that superdelegates have. What is it? They still have like a third of the power that they had before. So if you don't want to be democratic, if you want to run primaries and competitions unfairly, don't call yourself the Democratic Party. Call yourself the undemocratic party, because that's exactly what you're doing. So I find this completely egregious. And look, we need to be very cognizant of everything that they do. We have to watch them like hawks because we know damn well the Democratic Party establishment does not want to give up any power to Bernie Sanders. They want to relegate him to basically just being the cheerleader for the Democratic Party without actually giving him any meaningful power. We're not going to let that happen. If you fuck this up, then we get Trump again for another 4 years. And that's what it seems like the Democratic Party is willing to do here. They're willing to risk it all again. Also, they can get their preferred candidate in because they don't want Bernie Sanders to have any power because they're corrupt. Unbelievable. So I couldn't not talk about this story because I think this is incredibly important. We've got to watch everything that these shady bastards do.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.